All right, everybody, welcome out to your favorite spiritual podcast. Very excited to have you all here today. We are going to be going over some of the symbolism behind the story of Jonah, and this is going to be I'm going to be pulling from the work of Saint Maximus the Confessor. Now, I was really surprised when I started reading this because, well, actually, it's kind of strange. A couple days before I read this book, I had heard somebody else talk about the story of Jonah, and I had never realized that there was so much depth to it. I thought it was just a story of, a prophet that didn't want to be a prophet, and kind of just like it was a strange story growing up, and the way that it was always presented never made a whole lot of sense to me. But getting into this, and I realized there's a lot of depth to it. There's a lot of wisdom here. So I'm going to be going through the work of Saint Maximus, and that's going to be mostly what I'm drawing. I'm going to be making my own commentary, obviously, and my own interpretation, but it's largely based off of that. I'm probably going to have to do this again down the road, just because, to be honest, a lot of it went over my head. But we're going to get started, and it's going to be interesting. So if you don't know the story of Jonah, or if you just haven't heard it in a while, here's a refresher. Basically, God calls this guy named Jonah. He says, "Go to the city of Nineveh and tell them that I'm going to destroy them because they're wicked beyond belief. They're engaging in all sorts of evil practices, and it's got to stop. So go tell them this." And then Jonah decides, "Hey, if I go tell them that, God might spare them. They may turn away, they may repent, and then they won't be destroyed." And the vibe is kind of that he doesn't want them to repent. He doesn't want them to be saved. He wants them to be destroyed. He doesn't want to be an instrument in God's purpose here. So he decides to run. He decides to go in the opposite direction. He gets on a ship, he heads out, and he tries to run away. And while he's on the ship, this crazy storm rises up. Terrible, terrible storm, and everyone on the ship is afraid, and they're all praying to their own gods. He's the only Hebrew on the ship, and they're all trying to figure out, who have we angered? Why is this happening to us? What can we do? Let's make sacrifices. Let's make prayers. Let's do something. Jonah's asleep in the bottom, which is interesting. We see Jesus sleeping in the bottom of a ship later on in the New Testament, and there's something there with that too. But they wake him up, they bring him up to the top. They're like, "Hey, pray to your God, try to figure out if we can be saved because we think that we're going to die." And Jonah says, "No, it's me. I already know it's my fault. I'm in the wrong here. You're going to have to throw me overboard." And everybody says, "Well, we don't want to do that. Like, we don't want to throw you into the storm. We're not about it." So they try to get out of it on their own. They try to keep going, and Jonah just insists and says, "Yeah, no, like it's my fault. You have to throw me overboard." And they end up doing it reluctantly. They don't want to do it, but as soon as they throw him overboard, the storm settles. Okay, and you've probably at least heard this in passing, but the big fish, the whale, whatever, comes up and swallows Jonah, and it takes him down to the bottom of the ocean, and he sits there for 3 days and 3 nights. And while he's in the belly of the fish, he prays to God, and he basically admits that he was wrong. He repents. He puts himself in right in God's eyes. The fish comes up, spits him out, and he goes to Nineveh, and he tells them what God told him to. He says, "Listen, if God's going to destroy you in a couple of days if you don't turn away from what you're doing." And lo and behold, everybody listens, and like the everybody listens. Like the peasants listen, the king listens. They all go into a period of fasting and mourning, and they pray, and they express their sorrow, and they ask for God's forgiveness. And God looks on them with favor, and he decides to not destroy them. And Jonah's not happy about this. He's bitter about it. So he goes outside the city and kind of throws a little fit and says, he's bitter about it. And so he sits out there, and God sends up a vine to give him shelter because it's very hot. The sun is beating down on him, and it's very unpleasant. So the vine grows up around him overnight, miraculously, and he's enjoying the shade. But then the next day, a worm comes and eats away at the vine, and it dies. And now he's upset about this. Now he's complaining to God again. And the story ends with God saying, like, why are you upset about this? Like, why did you want me to destroy these people? They don't know what they're doing. They don't know their left from their right hand. They're in ignorance. All right. And that's why I sent you out here. And since they've repented and turned away, like, why is that upsetting to you? And that's kind of where the story ends. And it's kind of, it's usually taught as, if you genuinely change your heart, God will save you, right? If you actually express sorrow for what you're doing, if you actually turn away from the evil that you're doing, from your sinful ways, that you'll be spared. And there's also kind of this, but it's like, it's kind of a weird thing. Like, why is this in the Bible where, this prophet is not, why is God using Jonah? Why is he not using somebody that wants to be a part of this, that wants to be an instrument of good, and that brings light into the world and turns people towards God? And it's a very strange thing. It's very mysterious. And St. Maximus goes into it a lot. So we're going to talk about it. So, and this is, I'll tell you what I'm quoting from him. So I'm going to read some of it. He talks about, first, what does the name Jonah mean? He says that it can be translated a couple different ways. It could be the repose of God, the gift of God, healing from God, God's grace to them, the labor of God, a dove, flight from beauty, and their toil. So the one that I want to focus on, which obviously there's a lot there, but the one I want to focus on is dove. Just my own research, my own amateur attempt to kind of dig into this through the internet. Dove is one of the most consistent translations that comes up. I believe originally it's because it's very close to the same word, or it is the same word. And what is the symbolism of the dove, first of all? Well, the first time we see the dove, the white dove, is in Noah's Ark. After the world is destroyed, the dove is released, or I think first it's a raven that's released. It's a black raven, and it doesn't come back. When the dove is released, it comes back with the olive branch in its beak, and that lets Noah know that the world is settling, the flood is over, there's plants coming back up and everything. And there's some symbolism in the olive branch by itself too, but the dove is really interesting, and I don't think that it's talked about enough, because that in itself is a symbol of God's spirit. Because in Genesis, in the beginning, God's face hovered over the surface of the deep. The Spirit of the Lord was reflected in the waters. And so the dove coming out, so out of that reflection, that's when God begins to speak and to create. He says, let there be light. He starts to separate light from the darkness, the waters from the earth, and he starts to, grow things and populate things, and place the sun and the moon and everything, all the celestial bodies. And then from there, he starts to actually, put animals and plants, and then eventually people on the earth. So that dove is representative of, within the chaos, within the destruction, within the nothingness, the void, the formlessness of everything, as God's face was hovering over the surface of the deep. Well, after the flood, the dove is flying out over that, and that is a symbol of that same thing, because once the dove comes back with the olive branch in its beak, that is the symbol that there is a new creation, that things are starting over again. The chaos has ended. There's going to be life. And then so Jonah, as a symbol of the dove, coming to the wicked people, coming to the city that has not recognized God, that is worshiping their idols and themselves. And we'll talk about idols at some point too, pretty soon. That's the same image. And then fast forward a little bit to the baptism of Jesus. The Spirit of God descends in the form of a dove, and it lands on him. And that's the same thing, because the baptism is symbolic of that same chaos, that same destruction. God created the earth, people sinned, and then he destroyed everything except for Noah. And there's just the ark. There's just that little speck of righteousness. And out of that, God manifests his spirit. God sends the dove out over the earth and brings back the sign of new life. And the baptism is a similar story. It's following the same pattern. You're baptized, you're plunged into the chaos, into the waters, into the formlessness, right? And you're pulled back out, and you are a new creation. And so specifically when the dove came down to rest on Christ, that was a very symbolically loaded story. And it's something that gets overlooked sometimes. Because if you look at it just from a materialistic standpoint, just from a literal stance, then you just see, okay, well, God sent a sign of some sort. And yes, that does have meaning to it, that does have significance, but it's more than that. He's acting out the pattern of, there was chaos, there was sin, there was darkness, there was formlessness. Now we're bringing the Spirit of God to humanity. Now we're bringing the Spirit, and this is the start of something new. There is life now. Okay, so that's the interpretation of Jonah that I want to focus on. If you guys have other preferences, that's totally fine. But I'm going to keep reading some of his stuff. See, Maximus says, therefore, Jonah the prophet is a figure of Adam, of our shared human nature, of Christ, of prophetic grace, and of the ungrateful Jewish people who toil over everything good and are perpetually jealous of the graces of God. So he's kind of saying, look, there's certain, he gave the law, he gave he communicated with certain people, but those people did not steward it very well. Not all of them, obviously. And in any story, whenever the prophets come and say, look, you guys are wrong, you've become far too evil, I have to punish you, I have to destroy you, because if I let you keep doing this, you're going to do it forever. And we look at the Old Testament sometimes, and it's like this, oh, God is a wrathful, vengeful, hateful person or being, and he just destroys. He's very strict, very harsh, very severe whenever there's any sort of, you do something wrong and it's just fire and brimstone kind of deal. And that's not it, because that's not quite the right way to look at it. If you allow a child to do whatever they want, they become spoiled, they become unruly, they become kind of crazy, they don't adapt well to society, and so they don't have a sense of consequences. And so because of that, they just keep doing the same things that they want to do, no matter how destructive that is to themselves or to others. And it's the same for us as individuals, as adults. It's the same for societies, for cultures. Look at what's happening in our culture today. Look at what's happening in our world, at least in the United States, at least in the West. I can speak to that. There's a lot of bad stuff happening. And why? Because it's allowed to. We are in a time of relative peace and prosperity. Things are pretty easy, right? There's not anybody knocking at our door trying to burn our cities down. And so what happens? Well, because people have it easy, people don't have to suffer from immediate consequences. Like, you want to go sleep around, you want to go, preach things that are against God, and there's not this instant thing that comes back to it. You can get really deep into that, and it spirals out of control. It takes on a life of its own. And when you start, it maybe not so much with individuals per se, but when whole societies start to kind of push those boundaries and nothing happens, right? They get away with it. You look around like, how do all these bad people prosper? How are they doing so well? They lie, cheat, and steal, and they're successful. They have money, they have status, they have fame, they have power. And then so other people look at that and say, well, I want to do that too. I don't want to do the right thing, right? Like, if I do the right thing, I lose. Nice guys finish last kind of deal. And so there comes a point, though, because God's going to let us do what we want, right? Like, we have free will, we can do those things if that's what we choose. But at some point, if the culture, if the society is just breeding this chaos, this evil, it gets out of control, and it hampers the pursuit of righteousness in other people. And you can look at that in terms of the society. You can look at it in terms of your own life as well. If you are just engaged in getting ahead, you're only thinking about, how can I feel good? How can I gain pleasure? How can I get this short-term satisfaction? And you stop thinking about higher things, you don't put your focus on God, you can stay in that forever, right? I think drug addiction is a good way to look at it. You chase something over and over again. It feels good. This is what makes me feel right. This is what is enjoyable to me. And so you take your eyes off of, well, what's the big picture? What does my health look like? How is this affecting my relationships? How is this affecting how I show up in the world? Is this keeping me from being the best version of myself? And again, you have the freedom to make those decisions, but if there's never any punishment for it, if there's never any boundary that is set, you can do that forever. And so Maximus also talks about why pain is important. He points out that pain is not actually a punishment. When Adam and Eve sinned, there was the fall and pain into the picture. Well, that was actually God's mercy, because if he allowed us to just continuously pursue the pleasures of the flesh and the desires of our earthly existence, we would never turn our eyes to higher things, because there's nothing to stop us. Like, why would we, right? Like, it's easy to get fixated on that. And so in this particular picture, Jonah actually represents a lot of things. And it may be confusing at first to say that Jonah is the figure of Adam and of Christ. But remember that Christ came to embody humanity, but to do it right. He basically followed the same pattern that Adam and Eve were supposed to, but he did it the correct way. He didn't sin. So it's weird. It's weird to think about sometimes, I know, is to just kind of understand that, Christ is following this pattern where he takes everything that we did wrong and he gets it right. So he's kind of, he's that good example. He's that little bit of yeast that works its way through the whole bread. It's that one good example that everybody can follow, and it starts to veer us back on track. Okay. And also our shared human nature as well. And then Maximus says, Jonah is a figure of Adam and of our shared human nature when he flees Joppa, however you say it, to the sea. And again, what does the sea represent in this? We just talked about how the formlessness, the void, the chaos, how we, as human beings, we have this inclination to run away from what is good and to seek after darkness. In a sense, we are corrupted as physical beings. We are not perfect. And we have this kind of collective drive to self-destruction, in a sense, right? And so to flee into the sea is also symbolically loaded. That's something that you can kind of think about on your own too. What does it mean to run into that chaos? I'm sure we have those examples where it's like we want to do right, we want to do the good things, but we don't, and we feel this calling, we know we should do, but then somehow we end up not doing it. It goes on to say, when man is perfected in wisdom, he acquires unspeakable joy, a potent joy able to maintain him with godly and divine sustenance. So again, fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. So if you're wondering what is wisdom, well, wisdom is that keeping your sights on God, putting him first, because when he is your number one priority, when your hierarchy of needs, desires, and actions centers around following the will of the one who has set the rules, basically, everything else starts to fall into place. One, you have that guidance, you have that direction, but you also have a lot of clarity, because when you say, so if you're dating somebody, for example, and you don't know what you want, you kind of have to experiment, and you might talk to somebody that feels good and is exciting to you and is enticing and you're attracted to them. But if you don't have a clear hierarchy of values, if you don't look for their characteristics, then you can't make a wise decision. You can't make an intelligent decision. You're going to probably say, this feels right. And as earthly corrupted beings, we have that tendency towards short-term gain, towards pleasure, towards, well, this feels good, so I'm going to do it. Whereas if you have a higher ideal, you say, okay, what's really most important is that this person has good character. Are they somebody that is going to, be there for me? Is it somebody that's going to treat me the right way? Is it somebody that's going to treat my kids the right way? That was a huge breakthrough moment for me, because I was looking for, well, I want somebody that treats me a certain way. And then I kept, talking to people or dating people that they make mistakes. Everybody makes mistakes. I make plenty of mistakes too. I'm a very imperfect person. And anybody that spent time around me is very aware of that. But at the same time, I was like, I can put up with certain things, right? I can handle, I don't like being treated this way, but I can deal with it every now and again, as long as, everything else is good. But then when I started thinking, well, what's the real purpose here? Like, I'm looking for commitment. I'm looking to start a family. I'm looking for the long term. When I shifted into thinking, do I want my kids to be treated this way? All of a sudden, dating got a lot easier. It doesn't mean that I don't make mistakes, but it does mean that I have a lot more clarity. And when I talk to somebody, it becomes obvious pretty quickly. It's like, hey, yeah, I may be able to deal with this, but my kids should not. I think that might traumatize them. That's not how I want them to think about life in relation to this person. So wisdom, when you are perfected in wisdom, when you have this set of values and you're looking to God first, everything else starts to fall into place. You're going to make mistakes and everything. But like he says, you acquire an unspeakable joy because one, you're doing what you're supposed to, right? You're following your higher aspirations, which are spiritual, right? Because we have those. It's just that they're shrouded in what we want here on earth. All right. So he goes on to say, and like our forefather Adam, who when he lapsed was tossed from paradise into this world, so too our nature willingly was dragged down into the sea, parentheses, the brine of the sea, where it both bears and is borne along in the unstable, helter-skelter delusion and confusion of material things, even attending diligently to them. The more those who cling to this error and confusion profit from it, the deeper they are plunged into the sea and swallowed by the whale. So the whale in this sense also represents death. It represents the earth in a sense too, but it represents death. It's our life. It's where we are in the world. Okay, it's the thing that swallows us up, and the image of being dragged down into the sea. So you understand that this is chaos, this is formlessness, this is darkness, this is not the structure that God has created for it, because God didn't create humans first and say, go swim in the sea while I make the earth. He made the earth first. He made our environment for us and then put us in it. Okay. So when we dive into this confusion, the delusion, and I would say illusion too, to keep the little rhyme up, when we dive into that is, in a sense, that is our flight to the sea. That is our jumping into darkness. This is our chasing after things that are not good for us, right? And so why do we need pain? Why do we need discipline? Why do we need the fire and brimstone of the Old Testament, right? Because it provides that boundary to say, hey, this is bad for you. Stop doing it. And you're not listening to me. So I'm going to give you something that makes you want to run away from it, something that's going to correct you on its own. Okay. All right, up next. He says, human nature has slipped from divine benefits as from Joppa and has descended as though into a sea, into the misery of the present life and been plunged into the chaotic and roaring waters. I struggle saying that. The waters of attachment to material objects. So the sea in this case is our love of the world, right? It's our fixation on what's in front of us, on what we can tangibly experience and touch, and the things that our body wants, right? And that's something important to understand, because people get confused, like, why do I keep doing these things? Well, the body is actually, it's kind of a semi-separate thing from us, right? Like our consciousness, if we really pay attention to the things that we want, we don't understand why we want them a lot of times. We're drawn to things, and when we're really pressed and try to explain and articulate, why do I want this? We're just like, well, I don't know. If you really are try to articulate it, you'll find out a lot of times that you can't. I think, why do I want to, drink alcohol or do drugs? It's like, well, because it feels good. But why do you get to that point where you feel like you have to do it, even though you know that it's not good for you, that the way you're doing it is destructive, it's unhealthy, it's ruining people's lives around you, it's ruining your prospects for the future, it's ruining your health, but you still feel drawn to it. Why? That's part of our nature as members of a fallen world. And so the sea is this chaos that drags us into it. And when we willingly jump into it, when we willingly flee to it, we're trapped by it, right? And we're dragged down into those depths, and it's chaotic. Now, there's a couple things that are interesting to think about here, because the whale is often seen as, well, this is God saving Jonah, and it is, but it's also representative of death. So that's a weird kind of juxtaposition at first glance, but when you get into it, well, again, the death is a stopping point. It's saying, hey, this is going to end. If you don't turn your eyes towards something more meaningful, you're going to waste your life just trying to feel good. You're going to waste your life in this constant pursuit of earthly things that don't last. So in a sense, death is actually a graceful thing. It's something that God allowed in so that there's parameters. There's something to keep us of a somewhat sober mind to understand, hey, this is going to end one day, right? I work in cemetery sales. So I deal with people that are going through death all the time, people that are about to die, people that have lost a loved one. It's a very real, sobering thing to lose somebody. I thankfully have not had to experience that myself yet, but I see the effect that it has on people. It changes your perspective on life. It changes how you think about yourself and about your future. And so to meditate it on, or excuse me, to meditate on it to some extent is a healthy thing because it keeps everything else in perspective. It makes you understand that this is fleeting. This is not going to last. So the whale is a destructive thing. It's an evil thing in a sense, but it's also a saving grace. And it also is what saves Jonah. It also is representative of, it's a prophetic thing, right? Because Christ comes and he spends 3 days, 3 nights in the belly of the earth, which in death, in this ocean of chaos, of formlessness, of what is not of God, right? He goes into that and comes out of it. So there's that same pattern there that Jonah is following the same pattern of Christ, the same, which is just going off, or it's a continuation of what happened in Genesis with the flood. And we see this pop up over and over again. Same thing with Moses too. We need to do an episode on the crossover between Moses and Jesus. That's a really interesting one too. But he goes on to say, in the sense that human life has been submerged with temptations. That is, I love the imagery there. Like we're submerged into this darkness. It's not just that, hey, there's stuff that comes up every now and again. We're so far in it. We're like a fish in water. We don't even understand that this is darkness. This is illusion. This is evil. This is distraction. This is, not of God, because we're just so hopelessly immersed in it. It has been imprisoned by the complete ignorance of the mind and the overwhelming of rational thinking by the sheer pressure of vice. There's some coffee there. I love the way he speaks. It has been imprisoned by the complete ignorance of mind. We're so, like I said, we're so immersed in this that we don't even know that this is wrong. We don't even understand. And a good way to look at that, again, is back to desire, back to the body, because the body wants certain things. I want to be super successful, but my body a lot of times wants to be lazy, right? I want to have six-pack abs and be just an absolute, model-worthy person of like aesthetically, like I want to look really good, but I also really want to eat ice cream and cookies and whatever else. I've got some chocolate chip muffins waiting for me this evening. So it's like, but why? Where does that come from? And if you sit and you think about your hunger, a lot of times you realize you're not hungry. You've got these cravings for something and you try to not eat it and it gets more and more overwhelming. Where does that come from? Because your body wants something and your mind, your spirit is higher than that, but it's operating in this world through the body. So it's still immersed, it's still immersed in these illusions and this darkness and in the water. And also the second part of that too, the overwhelming of rational thinking by sheer pressure of vice. How many of us have had those times where we think that we're figuring something out and we spin our wheels endlessly, just constantly trying to figure out what is the right thing to do? How do I get out of this situation? And we think that we have it figured out. We think that we have it, that we can figure out the world, that we've outsmarted God somehow, right? And we may sometimes be overlooking things that are very obvious. Like, for example, if I'm trying to figure out how do I become wealthy, and I just put all my attention on that, and I start to come up with these great plans. And in the process of going through these plans and these little schemes that I have, and I had this happen to me a lot last year, actually, I realized, well, I'm overlooking some very important spiritual things. I'm overlooking relationships that I had in my life. I'm overlooking the fact that I'm putting all of my value on this. And so it's like rationally, I'm figuring some stuff out and I made progress, right? I'm sure we can all relate. Like you make progress on something, but then you realize it was the wrong thing. I was building something, but it was a house of cards. And I was looking at the form, I was looking at like what made sense to me, but I don't have that clarity of wisdom. I don't have, like that we talked about a second ago, I don't have that clear hierarchy because I've started to, I'm surrounded by the waters. I've gotten fixated on what is immediate and I can't see very far through those depths. So there's invisible currents that are affecting me. There's predators out there in the ocean that I'm completely unaware of, that I'm not going to be aware of until they're up on top of me. And a lot of that too comes from vice, from the things that trap us, the things that capture our attention. So I may think that I'm solving a problem and I'm figuring out a solution to move forward in life, but I'm unbeknownst to me, I'm actually being led by my body. It's like I think that I'm developing this great relationship and I'm figuring out how to solve these problems and I'm figuring out how to communicate and all this, that, and the other. But it's like on the bottom of it, like what's actually driving me to this person is a physical attraction. It's a lust, or maybe it's a loneliness, right? Maybe it's not necessarily that I'm seeking something as corruptive, but I'm unconsciously picking this person because I feel like I need to. I feel like I need to be with somebody, and I don't have that clarity to discern. Up next, he says, like eternal bars, human nature has ingrained proclivities towards material objects, which keep the mind from being freed from the darkness of ignorance to behold the light of true knowledge. So this ocean is a trap for us. It's like bars. They're invisible, though. They're bars of darkness. They're things that we don't perceive because we don't have that light shining bright enough within us. We don't have our sights fixated on what is important. And so the darkness of ignorance keeps us from beholding that light of true knowledge. He goes on to say, even if the evil one appears to conceal grace amid the torrent of persecution, as the whale concealed the prophet Jonah, he was nevertheless unable ultimately to hold grace in check and remains unable to alter the strength of God's ability to activate his grace. For this reason, the evil one caused the grace rather to be manifested even more distinctly in its disciples after they experienced opposition. And the more he did this, the more he undermined his own power in the attempt. I love this. Let's break it down a little bit because I had to reread it a few times. So if you felt a little bit lost, don't feel bad because I definitely was. And like I said, I'm going to have to redo this at some point when I've had it sit, or when I've been able to sit with it and let it marinate more. But he's talking about this specific story. He's also talking about the crucifixion and Christ overcoming death. But he says that basically Satan, the evil one, he wanted to conceal, he wanted us to perceive everything as being bad. Like he wants us to perceive death and pain, persecution, struggle as being a bad thing, something that holds us back, something that stops us, right? But in doing so, he calls grace to be manifest even more fully because God's still all powerful. And so if you have a super easy life, I know people that are like this. I know people that have had a lifelong devoted walk with God, and they admit, like, my life has actually been pretty easy. And I'm a little bit jealous of that, if I'm being honest, because I've made a lot of mistakes. I've gone on the wrong path quite a few times, and my life has been very difficult, right? But when you follow God, you have a certain amount of grace that comes with that. Like you're taken care of. If you never make wrong decisions, which obviously you're going to make wrong decisions, but if the overwhelming majority of your decisions are led by God, well, then the overwhelming majority of your life is going to be smooth. It may not be easy, right? It doesn't mean that you won't have challenges, but you're going to keep yourself from making it worse than it needs to be. So, for example, if I take a job and it's solely because I want to make money, and if I were to pray about it, I'm sorry, I keep hitting the microphone. If I were to pray about it, I might realize, you know what, that's not the environment that God wants me in. He wants me to go serve somewhere else. He wants me to go help people. And this is a very selfish pursuit. And then maybe 2 or 3 years later, I realize I've built up all this house of cards. I've built up, this wealth, quote unquote. I've built up some status. I've had some accomplishments, behind me, but it wasn't what I was called to do. And because of that, maybe I'm super depressed because I have isolated myself in the process. I have been very selfish, and I haven't turned my attention towards helping other people. So I don't feel any greater sense of contribution, right? I'm only helping myself instead of helping other people too. And again, life is fleeting. So what actually matters? Well, it's not the money that I accumulate. It's the impact that I have on eternity. And that comes through other people. That comes from how I relate to other people. Do I help keep them on the right path? Do I turn them away from what they're doing wrong and set them straight? Because if I do that, then that translates into after death, right? Do I bring other people to Christ? Do I bring other people into a better way of living? Because that's a much more meaningful thing. And so back to what I was saying about how some people that don't make as many bad decisions as I have had a much easier life. And it's not because they're necessarily better people. It's like when you walk with God, he's going to keep you from stumbling over things. He's going to, the foolish walk in darkness, and they don't know what they stumble over. That's from somewhere in Proverbs. But anyway, when you look at death, you may look at it as this really scary thing, as this bad thing. And that was certainly what the evil one wanted. He wanted us to fear the grave. But because God is still able to work through that, and because when in those moments, it's much more clear that this is a supernatural power and that God does have power over death. He does have power over the things that happen in life. He can take those bad things and turn them into something better. Inadvertently, evil kind of, how do I say this, shot itself in the foot, right? Because it's like you're trying to stop things. You're trying to make it look really big, bad, and scary. But in that, grace is manifested because we start to understand, well, God's greater than that. So the thing that we were afraid of, we have now experienced, and we've also experienced freedom from it because we've been saved from it. So that's a really powerful point that he makes there. The more that evil, the more that wickedness tries to overcome us, the more it undermines its own power in the process. And that's why illusion and darkness is the image that's used, because it's not a tangible thing. It's not like something that it can actually hurt you. It's something that can make you afraid. And because you're afraid, you start to you live in fear, right? You don't do the things that would be best for you. You don't wander into the darkness and find the hidden treasures there because you're scared, or you're focused on something that is fleeting, that is meaningless, right? Like I want this job, I want this person, or I want this ideal life or whatever. And it's not what's of God, but you get distracted from that. But the more that you start to understand that, hey, these things are just illusions, the more God's grace is able to make itself known in your life, because he has overcome all this. Up next, he says, okay, so I like this part. He talks about the sheep. The sheep. So this is after Jonah's been spat up from the whale. He's been rejected from death, basically. So that is an image of, in the same way that Christ overcame the grave and resurrected himself. This is a same. How do I say that? So I want to use a word besides symbolic, because I keep saying that. I don't want to say mythical either, because that implies something else. But there's something in the pattern, in the acting out of an archetypal story, and it's that same archetypal story because the death has spat Jonah out. He's come up from the depths. He's come up from the lowest place, which is where he prayed, where he repented, where he understood that this is where I need to turn away. And so so death has rejected him, right? Like God has overcome that. And I think that is also a symbol of rock bottom. You get to that point where you have descended so hopelessly into the abyss. The mountains of the underworld are up above you. Like you're not even on the surface of the earth. You're so far beneath the surface of the earth that you're in a whole new world. You're in a totally different dimension, a totally different life. It's like there's a landscape down there and you're just embedded in darkness and in despair. But out of that, if you get to that point and you realize God's still with me, that is the undermining of evil. That is where it's like you can't get away from God, and you are never too far gone for him to save you. But you have to make the decision, because he lets you make your own choices. He allows you to have free will. So when Jonah cried out to God, he saved him, right? And in the same way, when Christ had ascended into the grave, he also was pulled out of that. But then he gets to Nineveh. He starts to there's descriptions of, I won't get too far into, but there's descriptions of the people there and of the animals that are there too. So when they went into the period of fasting, they didn't drink any water, they didn't eat anything, but they didn't let their livestock either. It was everything. And so this ties in, interestingly, to the idea of like, why do we sacrifice things, right? Like, why did we sacrifice things, I should say? What does that do? Because it's not tricking God and saying, oh, well, as long as blood is shed, it's not a loophole. It's like, well, you were wrong, but you have the scapegoat, so I guess I'll let you off the hook. There's something deeper to it. There's something in the acting out of a pattern of experiencing death, of going through that, and of choosing to take something. Because remember that livestock back in the day was wealth. That was something that you had. It's also a living animal, but it's also something that this is something you can eat. This is something that you can get milk from. This is something that you can trade for other things that you need. So you're sacrificing something. You're actually giving something up and saying, I was wrong, and I'm willing to let go of some of my material wealth. I'm willing to trust that God will protect me and that he will continue to provide for me, even if I give up the things that I think I need, right? And that could be money in today's context, but there's also something in the shedding of blood itself and in the actual sacrificing of an animal. And when you think of our own animal nature, the way that we as a body are operating in the world, through the spirit, obviously through our consciousness, but there's something in participating in this pattern of, I'm actually going to cause death. I'm going to let go of something so that there can be forgiveness. Because in the same way that if we don't ever find ourselves confronted with death, we can endlessly pursue things of the world, and there's no consequences for that. And the bad part about that is that we don't focus on God, right? We never understand that we're trapped and that there could be something so much better, because there is something better than this world, right? There's a higher ideal that we can attain to. But if we don't understand that we have to let go of where we are now, we have to die in order to get there, then it corrupts our perspective. It makes it difficult to understand the value of it. But death kind of is that sobering moment that lets us know, hey, you have to get it together, right? You have to give up something. You have to give up your own life at some point in order to go to heaven. You have, in order to gain unity with the divine, you have to die to the physical. And so there's a miniature pattern where when you sacrifice an animal, you're kind of acting that out ahead of time. And it does something to you, right? If you just read about and talk about, I'm making this sacrifice, it may sink in on an intellectual level, but when you go through it, it hits in a totally different way. Another way to illustrate that would be to point out communion, right? Like, we don't just say Christ made the sacrifice. We do say that, obviously, but we also partake in the Last Supper in a sense. Christ said, do this in remembrance of me. He didn't say just talk about this and just think about it. He said, do this, right? Participate in this pattern of behavior. And so when we take the time to sit and take the bread and the wine, or grape juice if you're in a Southern Baptist church, and you say, this is the body of Christ, this is the blood of Christ, and then you take that into you, right? And through the act of eating, it does physically become part of your body. And your intention behind that is, I am considering that this is also the flesh and the blood of Christ, and I'm imbibing it into my essence, in a sense. And then we understand that in a totally different way, right? It does something to us psychologically. I think when we act things out, like when I was in the military, we used to do a lot of planning. We used to do a lot of dry runs, rehearsals. So we would have a mission, say, and it's like, the mission is to go through this building and to, clear it out, whatever. Well, we would look at the plan. We would figure out the mechanics of it. We would talk about it. We would kind of walk through it in different ways. We would look at it in the sense of intellectualizing it, strategizing. Then we would go through it and practice, right? And this is the important part, because when you practice something, when you participate in it, it becomes muscle memory. It becomes something that is a part of you. So when you actually go through the real event, you're able to adapt to changes. You're able to go through it without thinking about it. You're able to perform at a much higher level. And there's an analogy to be made between practicing something and participating in these patterns. Instead of just saying that I am repenting, instead of just saying that I understand the sacrifice that Christ made, you go through the suffering with them, right? You go through periods of fasting. You go through periods of sacrificing what you want right here and now in order to be reminded of the fact that Christ has suffered for you. And it does a couple other things too. And back to the livestock thing, when they were talking about how the inhabitants of Nineveh, they fasted, they didn't take food or water, their animals didn't either. Well, what is that? What is the point of fasting, right? There's something to be said in it's not just the people, it's not just the intellect, the awareness. It's also, I'm taking my livestock, I'm taking the animals in this city, and I'm also making them go through that period of fasting as well. So it's the conscious, the intellectual decision that I'm going to give up something that I want as a, an outward display of repentance. It's also that I'm going to take the animals, the bestial part of me, and I'm going to also subject them to that same pattern of behavior. In the same way that there's a sacrifice made, that I'm giving up something that is of a lower nature, of a lower order, I'm also going to force my livestock to give up what they want as well. So let's look at fasting just in general. If you're going through a period of fasting, you're going to still have those cravings for food. You're going to have those hunger pains. You're going to have, your body's going to tell you, I need this. I really want this right now. You need to give it to me, but you're fasting. You can't go do it. And out of that comes a sense of clarity, because you look at it more objectively. You realize, well, I can't go eat this, but I really want it. And it starts to get really difficult to not eat it. And you think, well, that's very strange, because I start to recognize the fact that my body is telling me to do something, but I start to learn I don't need it. And so there's a sense of freedom in that, because you're sacrificing your short-term gluttony, and you're understanding that I can feel like I need this, but I can still recognize that I don't. And so those, you say you take a day of fasting and you do that periodically. You maybe do that every week, every month, whatever. And you practice over and over, taking the time to say, I'm going through this process of not giving in to my desires. And because of that, I start to gain freedom from it, because I'm making those sacrifices. I'm in a sense, in a smaller sense, I am performing that burnt sacrifice. I'm giving up something. And because of this, it starts to free me. It starts to help me to differentiate between my will, between my spirit, between what like my higher intellect is actually thinking and wants, versus what does my body want? Because my body wants the junk food. It wants those chocolate chip muffins. My body wants to rest. My body wants to do all sorts of crazy things. And so it's important that the animals are fasting in this too, because it symbolizes, it's a literal thing, but it also symbolizes the fact that you can't just give up certain things. You have to fully engage in the process. You have to get into it. You can't just say, I'm repenting. You have to go through the process of giving up things. You have to go through the process of doing things differently. If you just talk about like your affirmations, for example, like I am strong, I am powerful, but you don't actually act on them. You don't build any evidence that this is actually me, then it doesn't sink in. And you can sit there every day in the mirror and say that you're going to be successful every single day. If you don't take action towards being successful, it doesn't resonate. Just like when you get involved in the process, when you make it a part of you, when you act it out on a physical level as well as an intellectual and spiritual level, it hits different. It affects you different. It actually takes tangible, it makes a tangible difference in your life. So he talks about the sheep, and I like this. He says that the sheep, culpable indeed, are those who, bereft of understanding, graze on the pasture of the contemplation of visible things by sense alone and with a view to passion. So the idea of grazing superficially on the knowledge, on say scripture, for example, and you understand it on like the mind level. You get it, but you just kind of graze on it. You don't sink your teeth into it. You don't make it a part of who you are. And that's kind of how he's referring to the sheep. And to some of the other animals in here, they look at the surface level of things, of visible things. They don't get into the spiritual side of things. They don't get into like deep down into the roots of it. They don't make it a part of who they are, and it's because of that they are guided by passion. Because on the surface level of things, life just kind of looks like passion, and we kind of think of passion as a strong word, but it can be a more subtle thing too, right? It can be that desire for food, that you're trying to focus on something more important. Say you're trying to focus on building your dream body, you're trying to get in better shape, you're trying to be healthy, right? And your passion for food, this desire, this pull that you can't quite get a handle on, overwhelms that higher aspiration, that grand goal that you had set for yourself. And I'm using these metaphors to try to make them relatable, but obviously this also, or the intention of this is that it relates to our walk with God. All right, next up. If I have had any technical issues, I apologize. I've tried to fix them, but up next he says, for whoever by reason of his genuine virtue forgets the passions of the flesh on his left, and who because of his impeccable knowledge does not succumb to the disease of a growing conceit over his accomplishments on the right, becomes a man who does not know his right hand from his left, or is not, as it were, roused by carnal passions. It seems then that the word is presumably calling vainglory about one's achievements, the right hand, and intemperance with respect to shameful passions, the left hand. So what is this referring to? Well, when Jonah is saying, but I wanted you to destroy them, and he's kind of pouting about it, God says, do you really want me to destroy a whole city of people who don't know their left from their right hand? And so you could look at that in the sense that they're confused, right? Like they're immature. They don't have that level of intellect to know left from right, to know right from wrong. And you can look at that in the sense of the tree of knowledge, good and evil, right? Like they don't understand that this is bad. They haven't, like they have eaten of the fruit in the sense, but they don't have a clear understanding of what they're doing is wrong. They're submerged still within the ocean. They're still shrouded by darkness. They're still in the midst of confusion, and they haven't had that light of clarity to show them the difference between right and wrong. So yes, they need to be set straight. They need to be punished in a sense. They know on some level the difference between right and wrong, but they're very immature in a sense. Their intellect and their spiritual intellect has not been developed to the point where they're really making it a coherent decision. They're not making an intellectual decision here. And so what Maximus points out, and he uses the left and the right in a slightly different, as like a symbolic thing, right? And so he says, on the left hand, he's using that as to symbolize the growing conceit, the passions of the flesh. So if you look on the one side, it's like, this is the things that drive us. These are our primitive impulses. These are our lusts, our desires, our impulses. And then on the right hand, there's the side of like an excess of purity, I guess, to where you say, well, I've mastered this and I have this figured out to some extent and I'm doing better, but you take that into the place of pride, right? And so you get out of one set of issues and you stop committing one set of sins, and you're, on that the left hand side of things, you're really just fixated on earthly things. You're really just caught up in the physical. You're at the bottom of the ocean. But then on the other side, you go too far and you say, well, because I have mastered this, because I have all these accomplishments, you become conceited, you become prideful. And so he's saying that there's no healthy middle ground of people that understand that, hey, this is wrong and I'm doing my best to do better. It's either people are totally participating in the wrong pattern, or they're thinking that they have somehow gotten themselves out of it, and they are mistakenly believe that they have somehow risen above it, right? So they look at the other people around them and say, I'm better than you, and because of that, I don't need to be saved or whatever. But because they've gone too far to the other extreme, they're not walking a healthy balance where they have a certain humility to say that this is wrong, but I'm not going to do it, but I am struggling with it. They think that they're better than everybody else. So that's kind of an interesting thing. He says, do not, in this sense, to not know the left from the right, for the rational knowledge of the virtues, or in other words, the true and active recognition of the causes of the virtues, induces the soul to completely ignore the two extremes of excess and defect that lie on either side, like the left and the right hand of the mean of the virtues. So I'm sure we can think of examples of people that believe that because they're not doing certain things, that they are better than everybody else. But in thinking that they are better than everybody else, they fall into a slightly different trap, but it's still the same ultimate trap. There's no balance between these two extremes because they're trying to do things on their own. And this, he kind of gets into some. So he doesn't leave the topic here, but he gets into some stuff that I thought was a little bit odd and difficult to get my head around, but it's certainly interesting. He says, whoever's mind has been absolutely elevated to the cause of created beings is fully ignorant of both, since he does not contemplate any principle within God, who is by essence beyond every principle, as far as all causality is concerned. Such a mind, having been drawn towards God and away from all created beings, knows none of the lower reason of things from which it has withdrawn. And in its ineffable vision, it knows only that God, it knows only God whom it approaches by grace. And so I think what that's pointing to is the understanding that, yes, you should try to be a better person. Yes, you should walk that path. But as long as you are within the realm of created things, like there's no point where if you're on the left-hand side and you go far enough to the right, like you pop out of the sphere of created things and you're suddenly one with God. Like you're still within that. If you go higher or lower within the sphere of created things, you are still created, right? Like there's not an escape from that. And so to believe that if you do enough of something that you somehow become like God is a mistaken belief, and is something that is going to cause confusion within you. And you're going to start to put your faith, you're going to start to put your your sights on something that is still within the realm of created things. If you think that you can earn your way out of this and somehow get closer to God, through your own actions, you are mistaken. That doesn't mean that you are free to do whatever you want. You're called to find a certain balance within this, because it's going to be destructive for you if you just say, oh, well, it doesn't matter what I do. Like you are in a sense moving further away from God. But what really saves us, what gets us out of that, is the fact that he wants to pull us out of that. The fact that he is able to still interact with us and to still, like, even though he is infinite and is not confined to the finite created sphere of existence. I don't know if that's the right terminology. It's not used in this book. In that sense, he is able to still to reach down and to interact with us and to provide his grace to move us in the right direction. But it's not through anything that we do necessarily. Like, we can't earn our way out of it. We can't walk far enough in the right direction and suddenly be with God. We have to walk the path that is set before us, but it's not through our own efforts, which is kind of a mysterious thing. It's hard to get your head around. It's definitely hard for me to get my head around. I'm still working on it. But it's important to understand that, yes, you need to do the right thing. But if you start to think that because you're doing the right thing, you're better than anybody else, you fall into that same trap as everyone, that you're trying to get away from. Maximus says, Nineveh then signifies the church of the Gentiles, which, having received the word of grace and turned from its former sin of idolatry, was therefore saved and considered worthy of heavenly glory. The booth, which is where Jonah was hiding underneath under the vine, the booth which Jonah made for himself after he left the city, represents the Jerusalem below and the temple built there by human hands. The vine, the gourd plant, prefigures the transient shadow of the carnal observance of the law in the letter alone, which is ultimately nothing enduring, nothing capable of enlightening the mind. And so how do I say this? So he's pointing out the fact that the law was, to go back to the left and right hand thing, if you were confused by that, which I certainly was, but he's also putting this in the context of the Israelites. He gave them the law, for example. He gave them all these commandments. And then by thinking that following the law was what was going to save them, they fell back into the same trap of following the letter of the law, but without the spirit, which is something that we talk about a lot on here. So he's pointing to, like, yes, the law is important, but it's not what actually saves you, right? It provides a structure and a framework within which you can start to the spirit can start to fill, right? It is a necessary prerequisite in a sense, but it's not the grace itself, right? And so he's pointing out that Jonah was very he wanted things to happen a certain way, and they didn't, and he's using that to refer to the Israelites in general. They had the law, they had what they needed, but they still sinned, they still turned away from God, and by putting too much focus on the law itself, they didn't accept Christ when he came. They didn't accept the Spirit when he came, and so that message went out to the rest of the world as well, and now it's available, for everybody. And the gore plant, the vine, prefigures the transient shadow of the carnal observance of the law and letter alone. So that's the thing that the sun was beating down on Jonah. He's uncomfortable. It's a harsh world. The law gives him some shelter. The vine gives him some relief from the sun. But because he falls in love with that, it has to be destroyed. It has to be dismantled to show that that's not what it's really about, right? And so Nineveh, in this sense, signifies the body of believers amongst the Gentiles who turn away from their former ways. They repent, and they didn't get the full benefit of the law, but it's revealed that that's not what's really most important. I'm trying to find the right words there. So that's how that ties in. That's how the left and the right ties in with the gore plant. Moreover, the Lord mounted his flesh. Oh yeah, this part's cool. This is actually kind of freaked me out a little bit. So we've talked a little bit about there's some interchangeability in the symbolism here. So Jonah, in a sense, does kind of represent not Christ himself, but the pattern that Christ is fulfilling. But yeah, this is cool. I'm just going to read it. Moreover, the Lord mounted his flesh on the fishhook of his divinity as bait for the devil's deceit, so that as the insatiable spiritual serpent, the devil would take his flesh into his mouth, since its nature is easily overcome, and quiver convulsively on the hook of the Lord's divinity, and by virtue of the sacred flesh of God, completely vomit the Lord's human nature once he had swallowed it. As a result, just as the devil formerly baited man with the hope of divinity and swallowed him, so too the devil himself would be baited precisely with humanity's fleshly garb, and afterward he would vomit man who had been deceived by the expectation of becoming divine, the devil himself having been deceived by the expectation of becoming human. So that kind of pulls a lot of stuff in together, because the serpent tricked Adam and Eve into eating of the fruit by saying you can be like God. So he's comparing when Christ comes and says, basically tempts the devil to kill him and to take him into death, right? And he's using the image of the fish that swallowed Jonah and relating that to the idea of a fish hook, right? So he lured death to come and overtake him so that he could show that he had power over death. And so it was I don't want to say trick, but it was an interesting little turnaround there, like the strategy of that. So by tempting death to come and take him, Christ was able to demonstrate that death couldn't hold us, right? That death couldn't hold him, and that there's hope for all of us, both in a physical and a spiritual sense as well. And so the image of Jonah being vomited out from the whale back onto the earth was also symbolic of the way that the grave could not hold Christ. And I really like it's a weird thing when he first says that the worm that represents Christ himself. I thought that's kind of a strange. I don't know how I feel about that. Like, if we can say that, relate Jesus to a worm, that doesn't sound right. But then he puts it in that context, like that is the bait that lures death in. Also, when the worm comes and destroys the vine, that is symbolic of Christ abolishing the law. And that's not to say that we don't have to follow the law, we can do whatever we want, but it's showing that the letter of the law is not what's important, because that worm came and ate away at it. And I think he doesn't say anything about it, but my own thought is that there seems to be a sense of finality of how you say it, like you turn things around. Like the serpent was what tempted Adam and Eve into eating the fruit that caused death, right? And then the symbolism of the worm, which is serpent-like, being what abolishes the structure that was implemented afterwards, which was supposed to keep us on track, but we abused it. We didn't use it correctly. We followed the letter of the law, and so that structure had to fall away as well. I think that there's a sense of finality in there. He goes on to say, it is this worm who smote the gourd plant and caused it to wither, or in other words, to abolish the observance of the law like a mere shadow. Been going for a while, so my speech is starting to slur a little bit. And then I kind of jumped ahead a little bit, so I'll just read some of this out. He went underground, Christ, he went underground, as it were, for my sake, in the mystery of his death and burial. For it is clear that after our Savior's resurrection and ascension, the wind, so this is going back to Jonah, sitting in front of Nineveh with the wind of the sun beating on him. After our Savior's resurrection and ascension, the wind of an exceedingly scorching summer heat appeared, and the vindication of the Gentiles came upon Jerusalem. Its power smote the power and glory, or the head, because it was beating down on Jonah's head, of every nation, and my Son of righteousness overcame it. So it's an interesting imagery to sit and kind of think about of, historically what happened, because they didn't, the Jewish people did not receive Christ very well overall anyway, when he came. And so afterwards there was a period of hardship. Pride is a stranger to nature and accordingly manipulates everything natural against its nature, and in its abusive way distorts the beauty of nature. I'm going to do an episode in the near future that's going to involve a lot of elements of pride. For now, just kind of like point out, we all know the story that Lucifer was proud and thought that he could be like God, and then he was cast down out of heaven for rebelling. He instilled that same sense of pride in Adam and Eve, thinking we can be like God. But of course, he was saying that from, that's too much to get into, but basically he instilled that same sense of pride and caused them to fall as well. And so he's saying, there was the people that were in confusion and didn't understand that what they were doing was wrong, right? Because they did not have the teachings of God with them to tell them, hey, don't do these things. And then you have the Israelites, on the other hand, who had the law, but were so proud of the law and their strict observance to it that they missed the point. They would say, Jesus in the New Testament talks about how, if you look at a woman lustfully, you should gouge your eye out. And I think that was my first episode, actually. It's like, he doesn't mean that literally. He's trying to make a point that it's not enough to sit there and say, well, I'm not sleeping with her, so I'm fine, when your heart is burning with passion. Like when you are committing the sin in your heart, like, I didn't scream at that person, I didn't murder that person, so I'm fine. I didn't break the law, but like on the inside, like it's corrupting you, like you're just seething with anger. It's like you're missing the point. And so like the left hand would be the confusion, the really indulgence in sin. The right hand would be in a strict observance of the law, but without the spirit that goes into it. He goes on to say, the body is not as capable of relationship with God and familial kinship as the soul, which bears the same mark of faith as all other faithful souls, as well as a common internal identity of will in relation to the good. With this internal identity of will, the law of the flesh is completely done away with, and the word of God alone is conspicuously, if I'm saying that right, manifested through the Spirit, uniting everyone in a common mind in the knowledge of the one God and in a single love for one another in concord. In such a relationship, no one is completely separated spiritually from anyone else, even if spatially and bodily they are separated far from each other. Hence, the wind of a burning heat is pride, a passion that despises both God and humanity. So when you start believing, so the pride is that separation. It's believing that you are better than somebody else because you do something and they don't do it, or because you don't do something that they do, right? And so you start to think of yourself as better than them, and that intrinsically creates separation between you and others. And since there's no spiritual separation, that goes back to like what happened in the fall. Well, there became separation. Everything was one. We were in communion with God, and then we became self-conscious, because of pride, because we thought we could be like God. Then came separation. We started to cover ourselves. We became self-conscious, and because we took our eyes off of God and put them on ourselves, we became very aware of our insufficiencies. So we covered ourselves, and then they got kicked out of the garden, and then Cain built cities, and that's more separation that goes on and on forever. And then you see where that's gotten us now. So he's saying pride is kind of the instigator of that. And Jonah had a certain amount of pride in thinking that that he could disobey God, but also too in that the people that he was sent to minister to didn't deserve to be saved because they didn't follow the letter of the law. They didn't do what he thought was right. Okay. And that's something that's easy to fall into. It's like we look at other people and say, well, I'm doing better than them. But that in and of itself is a pride. It's pride. So, all right, God does in truth both destroy and save the city of Nineveh. He destroys it by causing it to abandon its sin, and he saves it by correcting it with the acquisition of true knowledge. Or better yet, he destroys the city's sin with revitalized faith and brings about its salvation through the death of that sin. So when you look at it and say, well, God said he's going to destroy, he doesn't say, I'm going to destroy you if you don't turn away from what you're doing. He just says, I'm going to destroy you. And they repent and they pray to him. And so in a sense, he does destroy it because that act of making that, of declaring that destruction causes them to change completely, radically change. And so they have put to death their old ways. They have sacrificed their carnal desires. They have caused their body to and their mind to fast. They have forced their, like in the idea of the livestock fasting as well. Like you're not just saying, I'm not going to think about these things. I'm going to force my body to participate, even though it doesn't understand. It's a sheep that is grazing on the idea, like the body kind of knows that you want it to be super healthy, but it really also wants to be to eat certain foods, right? So you have to subject it to your higher will. You have to discipline yourself in a sense. All right. And then he kind of ties it back into the meaning of the name of Jonah. One of the translations was flight from beauty, or maybe that was a different name. Actually, I may be mistaken about that. But because of the name flight from beauty, Jonah signifies Adam and our shared human nature. So it's the pride that causes us to run away from paradise, right? Because we had paradise, and then the pride of thinking that we could somehow, jump ahead without going through the process of personal development and going through the process of obedience and doing what we're told, thinking that we can just be like God because we choose to be. That was a flight from beauty. It was the being cast down from the garden. And then he kind of starts to wrap it up. The 3-day journey signifies, so the 3-day journey that was towards Nineveh, from being vomited out from the whale. The 3-day journey signifies the 3 different ways of the godly life, or in other words, the discipline proper to each of the 3 universal laws. By universal laws, here I mean that the natural law, the scripture, law of scripture, we're going to say, and the law of grace. For each of these laws has a peculiar mode of life and appropriate course of action, since each generates a different disposition of the will for those who follow it. So it's not, so the 3-day journey is, there's 3 different things that we have to do. We have to follow the natural law. We have to follow the law of scripture. We have to follow the law of grace. So there's certain things in this physical reality that we cannot do. There's certain inviolable laws of nature that if we transgress them, there are going to be consequences for it, right? And so like a lot of Proverbs, for example, from my understanding, is that they seem kind of simple, but when you get down to it, it's like, these are the things you cannot do without bringing negative consequences on yourself. Back to the 10 Commandments, don't lie. Why? Right? Well, if you lie to people, you create a lot of disharmony between yourself and others. And if a bunch of people lie, then, well, you can't trust your society. If you lie to yourself and to other people, well, you can't trust yourself. So when it comes time to do something difficult, you don't have confidence in yourself. When it comes time to go through a difficult moment in a society, you don't trust each other. There's no unity there, right? So you can't lie. I mean, you can, but you can't do it without bringing negative effects on you. So you have to follow the natural laws and to follow the laws of Scripture. So there's certain things that God tells you to do that don't always make sense, right? But God doesn't want our understanding. He wants our obedience. And through obedience, we will gain understanding. And then, of course, the law of grace, because it's not enough to just do exactly what we're told. If we don't invite that grace into our lives, if we don't, if the Spirit does not fill us, if we do not walk in the purpose of that law, then we are, it's the same problem that Jesus was preaching against the Pharisees for. You're doing the right thing externally, but you haven't gotten the heart right. You're not killing this person, but you're still allowing hatred and pride into your heart, and that is controlling you. That is affecting you. Just because you're not doing the outward stuff that you're not supposed to do doesn't mean that you're getting the point of it. Okay. For each of us who has succumbed to the deception of material objects and delighted in bodily pleasure is all the while receiving the word of God like a worm, smiting him in his conscience and devouring his attachment to pleasure like the root of the gourd plant. I like that. There's always that underlying thing that whatever we have pride in, whatever we think is going to save us and going to fix it, it's like, underneath all of it, if we start to put our pride in human things, we may be allowed to, right? And then when the storms come and knock it down, it's a harsh awakening. God may destroy it out of a sense of grace, though, because it shows that, hey, this is not something that you can actually put your faith in. You have to put your faith in him. And then the last thing, we're going to wrap it up here. Indeed, mere fantasy deceives the mind and through passion causes vain attachment to objects that do not exist, but provides no foundation in reality. So thinking that the money is going to make your life better, thinking that the person is going to make your life better, thinking that this job is going to make you happy, thinking that eating that food is going to make you feel good, right? Like, these are things that they're illusions. And I think I like the word fantasy here in particular, because a lot of the things that we put our trust in are not even tangible. Like, there's something to be said for the impermanence of material objects, but there's also something to be said that, like, I put my trust in this plan that I have, and it's not a tangible thing, or I'm focused on getting this. We'll go back to the relationship. Like, I want to be with this perfect person, and that is going to make me happy. And it's like, well, it doesn't exist. Like, this is something that I have in my mind, and I'm putting all my trust in it, hoping that one day I'll be happy because I'll have this or that job or whatever. And it's like, it's not even real. Just like the cravings that we have for the chocolate chip muffins that I'm struggling to not go grab right now. Like, what is that? That's just an impulse. It's not real. I don't actually need the food. It's an illusion that makes me feel like I need the food, but it's not real. I may get in an argument with somebody and think that they are being disrespectful to me and think that I have been harmed somehow. But that sense of being harmed, like, they haven't actually done anything, right? Like, they may have said something that offended me, but nothing has hurt me. Nothing, like, they didn't hit me in the face with a baseball bat. They have said something and I perceived it as being harmful. So it is, but it's an illusion, right? And maybe I took their tone or their body language as being confrontational, but I don't even know that that's what they meant. They could have been intimidated by me and started to tense up, and they were just being defensive, right? And I perceived that as being aggressive. This kind of stuff happens all the time. This is something I talk about on my other podcast a lot more. But yeah, understanding that we have to get out of our the current association that we have to material things, to this world, and to our perception of it. It's important to break that and to understand that the law of grace needs to come into effect, and we need to allow God to work on our hearts and to change the way that we organize our priorities. And I think that this has been, I don't know if I presented it very well. I hope I did, but this particular story is a great example of that. It's a very archetypal story. It's very deep, and I didn't realize that until recently. So I was excited to share it with you. I hope that you guys enjoyed it. If you did, share with your friends, hit that little 5-star review And yeah, let me know. I'll see you guys soon.